Welcome to the Intrusions Indepth podcast. I'm Josh Depp. This is an addendum to the previous episode on NotPetya. There's more I wanted to discuss about the nature of cyberwar that just didn't fit the story of NotPetya. At a high level, though, it's how the norms of cyberwar, in quotes here, are completely different than those of kinetic or more traditional war. I also touch on the information war aspect as well. But maybe we're starting to cross a new Rubicon, and that these attacks are no longer defacements of web pages or DDoS attacks like those in the past, but targeting of critical infrastructure, shutting down of medical facilities, or disruption of them at the very least, and the truly disgusting acts of releasing people's sensitive information like medical procedures, abortions, mental health records, or child history records, or child records of their medical procedures. Tying it together, maybe it's time to leverage more of an information war around activities in the cyber realm. I hate that word, but I've got to come up with something better to use. At least in Gran Turismo, when we can push people to the Shadow Realm or in the Outworld realm for Mortal Kombat. But anyway, I'm getting away from it and kind of ahead of myself. Going back to Clark's definition that we used in the episode, actions by a nation state to penetrate another nation's computers or networks for the purposes of causing damage or disruption. End quote. Given the recent report from the CSRB about Microsoft's issues with Storm 0558,
China,
and their ongoing issues with the SVR, Russia's external intel agency, you can think of them like the CIA here in America. That line gets blurry. I read a recent piece from Wired written by Eric Geller that dives into the issue. I'll link it in the show notes. The big issue being that with the overlap of civilian and military technology, everything becomes another nation's computers or networks fast. Quote, the U.S. government's dependency on Microsoft poses a serious threat to U.S. national security, says U.S. Senator Ron Wyden. The government is effectively stuck with the company's products. Despite multiple serious breaches of U.S. government systems by foreign hackers, caused by the company's negligence. End quote. First of all, it's pretty meta that I got a quote within a quote. But anyway, what you really have to say is tell us how you really feel, Senator. But this also led to Senator Wyden to propose a bill to get the government off collaborative software like Microsoft Office that, quote, doesn't integrate well with competitor software, end quote. Well, for one thing, I don't think Microsoft likes to hear their name and hints of monopoly from the U.S. government. And while I think it's good intentioned, I don't think this is painless by any stretch of the imagination. Far from it. I'm also highly skeptical of the timeline. Maybe triple or quadruple it. That's probably being generous as well. For one, the learning curve on something new is real. From a blue teamer's perspective, we know this and try to exploit it. Think about the David Bianca pyramid of pain. We go after the top items as those are behavioral indicators, thus harder to change. We're targeting the human issue or the human element because change is hard. Now, if you've been paying attention to the jobs report for the past few years, there's been a steady increase in the amount of government workers being added. New government workers who have been using Microsoft for the better part of their professional career and probably personal life as well, on average. I know there's probably some guy that builds his own drivers for his Arch Linux ThinkPad that works for the government too and is triggered right now.
Actually, you're wrong, Josh Depp.
Not you, man. This is a generalization. Anyway, getting the entire workforce off of Microsoft for something like Google Workspace and MacBooks could possibly increase security, but would the lack of productivity be too much of an issue? I think the President Obama campaign used Chromebooks as a security measure, but maybe I misread that. I do know they used YubiKeys, and people made a big deal out of it. I don't think the forced use of MFA, and thus having YubiKeys or something like YubiKeys, would trip up many people and would go a long way for securing networks. But if the move from Microsoft was more extreme, what about all the .NET devs that maintain government websites and the custom web apps used by the government? I mean, sure, I don't think DTS could get worse. I'm joking. DTS is probably written in Java anyway. But seriously, how would those teams and maintenance of the apps continue? Like the NotPetya victims, most of the world that uses computers aren't security focused or even tech focused for that matter. Do we want to burden judges and court clerks with learning new software at the expense of slowing down court proceedings? What about making it harder for Medicare claims to get processed? Are we ready for longer times at TSA? Now, this is just some of the considerations that we need to take into account, and I'm sure I'm missing many important examples. I've thought of this for like 5 minutes. In my personal observations, during the pandemic years, people were not patient when it came to overburdened workers. If they can't be burdened by the government shutdowns and a novel virus, learning a new operating system isn't going to fly. On the other side, GCP, Google Workspace, they seem to have far less breaches, or at least news about security incidents altogether. Maybe my algorithm is tweaked because I use their products and it keeps me out of the loop. Sorry about that. My tinfoil hat was covering my eyes for a second. But this could also be because attackers don't waste their good stuff on Google, since they know the juicy stuff is on Microsoft. Those dev cycles are devoted to Microsoft exploits instead of looking for other exploits in different operating systems. Maybe they just don't want Google tag up in there. I mean, between them and Krebs just doxing ops, it's rough out there if they get on your case. We also have some evidence of this transition. Other nations have tried to uncouple themselves from Microsoft with varying results. Starting with Germany, Munich tried this from 2004 to 2017 with Linux, or Linux, if I'm saying that wrong. It's a custom Linux distribution that they ended up scrapping because employees complained about using LibreOffice and that entire ecosystem. It's also worth pointing out that some people believe it was for political reasons, as Microsoft did move a headquarters to Munich, ironically, around 2016, which, to be fair, probably had something to do with it. Linux, or Linux, Linux, was targeted at the public sector employees. The goal was noble: save money and be more open with exercising control of their environment. But it was challenging, as the rest of the world, and probably Germany, still used Windows. And Microsoft knows how to lobby governments. Let's keep it real here. Now onto the communists. North Korea released their own version of Linux in 2010 dubbed Red Star OS. It had a standalone Firefox browser and was essentially a vanilla Linux distro. I doubt many people use this within the country as they have a hard time with electricity, but I could be wrong. I would also assume that intel agencies had a good time finding exploits for that operating system, and knowing that they didn't have to disclose these bugs to Microsoft probably helped. But the goal here was to monitor the populace and control/censor the information while not relying on the West. Next, we go to Russia. Russia began putting resources in Astra Linux around 2019 for the same reasons, moving away from the West and enhanced security, especially in the government and military systems. Russia regularly conducts exercises in which they isolate themselves and their internet, but details on Astra Linux are a little scarce. China has also been experimenting with their own operating systems. Now, this one's interesting to me because I think they could do this. I mean, they have a real shot. They have the experience and probably the stolen intellectual property to iterate on this endeavor and make it something worth using. Now, around 2014, China made Neokindlin, an OS for their government machines, and since 2020, they've been working on Unity OS to get away from Western products, which admittedly is an ironic name for something made to separate. But the goal here appears to be to uncouple from the West and not be at the mercy of Western government. I mean, they would know a thing or two about ordering companies to do their bidding, after all. Uncoupling from the West sounds like a good idea on paper, but the execution's difficult. Just as we saw in the pandemic, uncoupling from the East is hard as well. However, given the sanctions and Microsoft disabling service to Russia over their current conflict, China may see this as a needed precaution, especially if they plan on invading Taiwan. Also, there is the possibility that if things got bad enough, the US government could go to Microsoft and tell them to backdoor Windows. And there's a chance that works. I mean, I'm sure it's probably not hard to imagine some high-ranking government official in the United States, say President Biden, for example, went to Microsoft and said, "We won't buy, insert any Microsoft program unless you backdoor Windows 11 so we can win this war." Maybe they cave. We saw Apple push back, but Apple doesn't have the contracts and footprint in the United States government that Microsoft does. Plus, they did it on a crappy case, the San Bernardino shooter. In case you're unfamiliar with that case, I'll give you a high-level overview. In 2015, 2 shooters entered a holiday party and killed 14 people and injured another 22. They fled, got in a shootout with the cops, and as shootouts with law enforcement typically go, the shooters died. The FBI wanted to unlock their phones as they believed that they were extremists with possible connections or contacts worth investigating. Pretty run-of-the-mill law enforcement work there. Now, Apple said no, and thus a legal back and forth took place until the feds withdrew the request. They found someone else to break into the phone. On the other hand, Apple has recently caved to the CCP's demands to remove VPN services from the App Store. So maybe they would cave if the profit margin was there. But back to Microsoft and this article from Eric Geller. One point in the article is that despite being breached again, there have been no consequences to Microsoft. I mean, the attackers were able to jump from a test environment to a production environment in one of these attacks. That is fundamentally wrong. Or being able to snoop on multiple U.S. agencies' communications from one intrusion. Also, not a good look. Requiring an expensive license to have access to the logs to catch this activity isn't a good look either. And I'm not trying to dunk on Microsoft here. They have issues, sure, but they also have a huge portfolio of products. Needs to support backwards compatibility for all manner of things, while expecting to drive higher profits every quarter. They are building Azure fast, and while cloud adoption rates and cloud market share may look great to the analysts on their earnings call, this speed exposes their customers to potential bugs that could get them pwned. Potential customers like the US government and other highly sensitive organizations. And Azure is very complex. I can't stress this enough, though. The world is a better place because of what Microsoft has added to it. GitHub is absolutely great since being taken over by Microsoft. They make the best text editor, VS Code. Windows is used everywhere, from HMIs and OT systems to emergency rooms and everywhere in between. Not to mention the fantastic staff who builds this stuff. Well, let's not forget that these are state-sponsored actors attacking them. They didn't ask, at least I didn't see, for Russian and Chinese pen tests to occur for their products. Also, even the best companies have errors, dumb mistakes, bad luck, or some combination of them all. So once again, the point isn't to dunk on Microsoft or to make them look bad, but I want to expand on this from another angle. What has been the retaliation to China and Russia for these breaches of a vendor relied on by the federal government? Now, I'm not trying to advocate for war or anything like that. The question is rhetorical, as I doubt the West, America, would claim credit for anything like that. See the ending of episode 1 if you want more reference. Plus, it's a fine line of escalation. I don't have the answers. I also don't have all the facts or data points of the situation, but on the surface, there seems to be impunity. Granted, these are nuclear nations, world superpowers, so this makes things difficult. Once again, I'm coming at this from a position of humility and curiosity. I'm trying to ask the questions. Maybe it makes sense to play the information war after all, though. Publish some American wins in the form of shadow pieces in the New York Times that claims responsibility for something high profile in those nations. This isn't unheard of. President Obama got up there on the White House podium and said that North Korea was behind the 2014 Sony incident. Oh, and we're doing a future episode on that. Believe that. He didn't think that giving in to the intimidation and pulling the movie, The Interview, was a good idea and vowed a response. Days later, the North Korean internet went dark. I've linked the Washington Post article describing it. Was it the government? Was it vigilante hackers? Was it North Koreans messing up DNS? Bad BGP routes? Well, obviously, no one from the United States claimed responsibility, but it puts a seed of doubt out there. Maybe that's enough. And this was over a movie with James Franco and Seth Rogen making fun of Kim Jong-un and some actor pay getting released. North Korean nuclear capabilities weren't as robust as they are today and nowhere close to China or Russia. So it is kind of like picking on someone smaller, but nevertheless, one could argue it proved a point. Alternatively, there's no problem providing intel or resources to Ukrainian troops actively engaged in a kinetic war with Russia. There's no problem funding Taiwan to stand up to China publicly. Now, I'm not saying the U.S. shouldn't do those things. On the contrary, I think they should. Just dealing in realities here. The U.S. is doing those things right now. The Pentagon has contracts with Starlink to provide service to Ukrainians, which in my opinion starts making SpaceX look a lot like a lawful military target. And as I understand it, they were providing the service for free during some of this time as well. That's got to keep the CISO up at night. And I want to stress this, that I'm not saying cut things off to Ukraine or make things hard for them to repel the Russians from their soil. Additionally, I'm not advocating for any actions against SpaceX. Just trying to say that these are hard choices, and you need to make sure that you're measuring the risk correctly. Now, this isn't novel, but from a Russian point of view, shooting down a Starlink satellite, super difficult. Targeting the Earth-based equipment that the Ukrainians are using can also be difficult. They can move it around. NotPetya, Starlink's operations on Earth, seems more doable. Is Starlink more important than Microsoft? But back to the definition. When infrastructure is shared, that line for cyberwar is blurry. And as we've been seeing in North Korean missiles used by Russia, that the chips from commercial entities, despite being sanctioned, are used throughout those weapons. The point is that commercial chips can and do provide support to military weapons because of the intermingling of technologies. And speaking of points, I think that covers what I wanted to accomplish in this episode. Let me know your thoughts. Intrusions Indepth on Twitter, X, Elon's site, or by email, intrusionindepth, all one word, at proton.me. Or you can visit the website, intrusionsindepth.com, for all this information and more. Thanks for listening. And let's have the shadow brokers take us out.
Your wealth and control depends on electronic data. You see what Equation Group can do. You see what crypto lockers and stocks that can do. You see free files we give for free. You see attacks on banks and Swift and News. Maybe there's an Equation Group version of crypto lockers that study for banks and financial systems. Equation Group lose control of cyber weapons. Who else lose or find cyber weapons? Electronic data go bye-bye. Wealthy elites, hey with them cattle. Do you feel in charge? Wealthy elites, you send